No one knows for sure how traders found out about Hawaiian sandalwood, but some suspect that it may have been in a load of firewood brought to an American ship. By 1790, sea captains were sending crewmen to search for sandalwood. By 1805, it had become an important export item. The peak of the trade was reached in 1818. Most of the trading was with Americans, but sandalwood's main market was China. Seeing its value, Kamehameha declared the sandalwood trade a royal monopoly. The chiefs traded in the name of the king. The king himself became a skilled bargainer. If he was unsure of a trade, he would not complete it without consulting one of his advisors, such as John Young. Travelers to the islands reported that whole villages were deserted while the people were in the mountains cutting sandalwood. The Hawaiians owned few horses, therefore the islanders themselves carried the sandalwood many miles. This labor weakened the workers and left them little time to cultivate their fields. When the king learned of this condition, he ordered the chiefs and commoners not to spend all their time cutting sandalwood. He placed a kapu on young trees in order to conserve this natural resource. Kamehameha wanted to build up a fleet of ships for both trade and military purposes. Before his death, he had bought at least 6 ships. 2 months before, Kamehameha bought 16 kegs of rum, a box of tea, and $8,000 worth of guns and ammunition, paying for them with sandalwood. Near the end of his reign, Kamehameha tried to enter into the overseas sandalwood trade. He sent a ship loaded with sandalwood to Canton. The sandalwood could not be sold at a profit, and port charges added to the expense of the voyage. Kamehameha learned that other nations charged visiting ships for harbor, pilot, and port fees. He decided to do the same at the harbor in Honolulu. Sandalwood was usually bartered for goods. In the early years of trade, Hawaiians were offered simple items such as bits of metal scraps and nails. By the 1820s, however, they wanted different types of goods. They wanted blankets, cotton, silks, turpentine, hardwood, muskets, and powder, alcohol, and rice. A few years later, they added goods made in England to the list. After Kamehameha's death, all royal controls on the sandalwood trade, which had become the main source of the island's wealth, were ended. Liholiho, who succeeded his father as Kamehameha II, allowed favorite chiefs to engage in the trade. In the following years, competing traders tried to persuade chiefs to sell sandalwood for goods for which they had little need. The traders were so eager to sell their goods that they let the chiefs buy on credit. Since the chiefs could not always deliver the sandalwood immediately, they signed promissory notes to pay a certain number of piculs of the wood. Often, the notes could not be collected. If the traders pressed too hard for payment, the chiefs would buy fewer goods. The chiefs were also reluctant to pay when they found, for example, that the ships were rotten. Meanwhile, the supply of sandalwood became scarcer each year. Before the arrival of Captain Cook, the Hawaiians produced nearly everything they needed and only as much as they could use. The fur and sandalwood trade led to the introduction of new goods from Europe, the United States, and China. The Hawaiian economy was now one of trade and gain. At first, only the king and the chiefs benefited from this trade. Even under the royal monopoly, the chiefs kept 4/10 of the sandalwood they collected for private trading. The royal monopoly ended with the death of Kamehameha I. Some imported haole goods were American cottons, woolens, nails, English saddles, Russian canvas, cocoa, flour, soap, and rice. Other goods included hemp, French wines, cordage, Chinese cotton cloth, turpentine, crockery, and glass, harnesses, iron pots and pans, papers, and ink. Very little money was used up to 1825, as most of the imports were traded for food or sandalwood. New foods were added to the native diet. By 1825, cabbage, potatoes, corn, limes, and pineapple appeared in the markets of Honolulu. Ducks, turkeys, and European breeds of chickens, pigs, and dogs were also introduced. Mango trees were brought to Hawaii in 1824. Another result of the fur and sandalwood trade was the settlement of foreigners in the islands. Some worked for the kings and chiefs. They built sloops and schooners for inter-island trade, transported provisions, and gathered sandalwood. Others were businessmen, ranchers, or missionaries. But most of the foreign residents were drifters and stranded or runaway sailors. The coming of foreigners had a terrible effect on islanders' health. The common diseases of foreigners, such as measles, influenza, and colds, to which the Hawaiians had no natural immunity, were fatal to large numbers. Also, heavy drinking of alcohol, introduced by the foreigners, weakened the health of the Hawaiians. The increasing scarcity of the sandalwood trees and the growing demands of the king and his chiefs for trade goods led to the harvesting of large quantities of immature timber, which brought lower prices. The royal domain was stripped of sandalwood to gratify the tastes of its upper class, encouraged by easy credit. The Hawaiians' huge sandalwood debt was renegotiated several times as merchant traders continued to charge inflated prices for trade goods, leading the king and the chiefs into owing more sandalwood than they could deliver. Eventually, traders sought the aid of their individual governments in collecting these monies, but it was years before the Hawaiian national debt was retired. It is estimated that over 100,000 piculs, or over 13 million pounds, of the fragrant lumber, worth more than $1 million, was stripped from the mountains and hills of Hawaii during the first 30 years of this trade. The unpaid debts contracted in the time of Kamehameha I and II, including interest, may have reached as high as $200,000, of which most was owed to American merchants. By the mid-1830s, supplies of sandalwood were virtually exhausted, and other commodities, such as salt, coconut oil, and beef cattle, had begun to take its place. The sandalwood trade exacted a heavy price in human life and health and in ecological damage. In 1823, the Reverend William Ellis described the transport of sandalwood from the adjacent mountains to the beach at Kauai by between 2,000 and 3,000 men, carrying each 1 to 6 pieces of sandalwood according to their size and weight. It was generally tied on their backs by bands made of tea leaves. Lacking food and suffering from an excessive workload, many laborers died, contributing to the general decline in the Hawaiian population. As the labor force was drawn away from the fields and fish ponds, less time and energy were devoted to subsistence crops. Society was turning into a market economy, and the new foreign trade articles and luxury goods quickly became necessities, particularly for Hawaiian leaders. Eventually, this situation created a large negative trade balance. Changes in the patterns of trade resulted in a number of impacts upon the native culture. As the chiefs increasingly incurred debts for imported luxury goods, they imposed additional taxes and expectations for service upon their tenants. For example, in 1831, an additional tax of 1 picule, or 133.33 pounds, of sandalwood was levied on each individual. The wood was to be brought from the mountains and deposited with the authorities at Honolulu. Those who failed to comply with this tax were fined a sum of $4. The Hawaiian historian David Malo wrote that the chiefs seem to have left caring for the people, and the people are more oppressed at the present time than they ever were in ancient times. The raising of cash crops left less for the well-being of the individual tenant farmer, resulting in increased numbers of poor and homeless. The landholders also spent more and more time away from the land as they dealt with the foreign traders at Honolulu or other port cities. Thus, the power of the konohiki grew, again resulting in increased oppression of the commoners.